Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Photoshop workshop with Studio Co. My name is Toby and I will be leading this workshop today. Before we get started, I just want to say that this is a workshop geared towards complete novices, people who have never even opened the Photoshop application, much less done any actual editing inside of it. So if that doesn't sound like you, you might be better off looking for a different tutorial. With that being said, let's begin. So the first thing you want to do to get started on Photoshop, obviously, is open the application. So I'm going to come down to my Windows icon, find Photoshop, and click on it. We will give it a second to load. Once Photoshop loads, the first thing you will see is this home screen. In the home screen, you can see your recent projects. You can also work with various tutorials if you want. Up here, you can access your cloud documents, your Lightroom photos if you've been working in Lightroom, and you can also create new documents or open old ones that don't appear in your recents. It's good to note that you can access the create new and open options under file up here at any time. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and click on this big create new button. When I do, this new document window appears, and in the new document window is basically where you set up your canvas before you get started. You can see here recent presets that I've used. You can save presets if you'd like, and you'll find them here. And then they just have presets that are common to different media. So photo presets, you see 7x5, I'm sure there's an 8x10, there it is. Print, letter, legal, tabloid, all that jazz. Web has different ones, and you can see the preset measurements change from inches to pixels. And there's a couple different ones for mobile, film, and video, and all that jazz. But I'm gonna come back over to print. I'm gonna stick with the standard letter size. I'm gonna come over here to preset details. This is where you can actually control the document customization before you get started. I'm gonna go ahead and call this practice 2. This button here next to the name is where you can save the preset if you're going to use it in the future. I'm not going to because it already exists under print. You see your width and height, which are pretty self-explanatory. This drop-down menu allows you to change your units of measurement. I'm going to stick with inches. That's what I prefer to work with. I'm going to go ahead and make the orientation landscape instead of portrait. Artboards, I'm not really going to talk about now, but I'm going to leave that unchecked. Resolution, 300 is a bit high, so I'm going to change it to 150 just so I have a smaller document size. Even if there is a little bit of quality loss, you can change your resolution from pixels to inch to pixels to centimeter. I'm going to work with inches. But you want, if you're working with final products that are going to be printed, you want to work with CMYK color. If your final product is going to be solely online, that's when you work with RGB. Like if it's only going to appear on screens, you're never going to print it. But let's say that I am planning on printing this when I'm done. I'm going to change it to CMYK. The bit depth, there's not a huge difference between 8-bit and 16-bit. 16-bit will be slightly higher quality, more color information, and also larger file sizes. Background contents white is fine, and advanced options I won't get into, so I'll just close that. Now that my settings look good, let's go back to horizontal landscape mode. Now this all looks good, and I can click create. So after you hit create, this should be the screen you are greeted with. If it's not, I want you to come up here to your top nav bar, click on window, go to workspace, and you want to make sure essentials default is turned on. If it is turned on and your screen still looks different, then what you want to do is make sure that it's checked and click reset essentials. All right, now before I dive into actually working inside the program, I'm just going to go over this default interface a little bit. So your main area right here with the big blank white rectangle is your canvas. Over here on the left is your toolbar. Above your canvas are your tool settings, which change depending on which tool you have selected. At the very top is your top navigation bar. I don't know if that's the technical term, but that's what I'll refer to it as. And then we have our color panel, which includes swatches, gradients, and patterns. We have our properties and adjustments panel. The properties just describes either the canvas or your selected layer, whereas adjustments are sort of like filters that you can apply to your image, and we'll get to those later on. And we have our layers panel, which includes layers, color channels, and paths, and I'll talk more about paths and layers in a little bit. Finally, we have our learn panel, which is where you can find tutorials. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that, as well as the library panel, where you can either import stuff in your Adobe library or search for common libraries. I'm going to go ahead, minimize that to free up some real estate. All right, so now we're set up, we're ready to go. Let's place some images that we want to edit. So in order to actually put an image onto your canvas, you're going to want to come up to File. You could open an image, but that would open the image separately. It wouldn't place it on your canvas. So what you want to do instead is under File, go with either Place Embedded or Place Linked. And I'm going to talk about the difference between these just a little bit before I actually do it. So Place Embedded makes a copy of whatever image it is that you are going to place on your canvas and saves it within the Photoshop file itself. This results in a slightly larger file size, but the benefit is that if you were to save your Photoshop file and open it on any computer, you would still have all of your images contained within the file. Place Linked, on the other hand, basically creates a path to the image that you place wherever it is on your current computer. So basically creates a path to the current folder location of the image. The benefit to this is a smaller Photoshop file, but the downside is if you were to save your Photoshop file and open it on another computer, all of your images would be missing because the links would be broken, because it'd be following a file path to a folder or directory that doesn't exist. I personally tend to work across a couple computers, so I'm going to go Place Embedded, but again, if you're going to work on the same computer all the time, Place Linked is probably the best bet just to save space. We'll go Place Embedded. I'm going to go ahead, navigate to my images folder. I'll go ahead and place a background first. Let's go with space. Who doesn't love space? I'm gonna go ahead, click place. It's gonna try to automatically fit it on the canvas. I'm gonna go ahead and actually we'll just leave it like this. So placement looks good. I'm gonna go ahead and either click this check mark or hit enter on the keyboard. And now we have an image. Before I go on, I'm going to go ahead and just place another foreground image on top of space. The astronaut would make a lot of sense, but I think I'm going to go with the lizard. Hello, mighty space lizard. Awesome. And I like that scale. That looks pretty good. We'll just leave him as is. All right, so now we have our lizard, we have space, and we can talk about layers. So if you'll look over here in our layers panel, you'll see our original background layer, which is layer 0. I'm gonna go ahead and lock that so we're not accidentally moving that one. And we have our space layer and our lizard layer. And the important thing to know about layers, a few things. So first off, any image that you place, as you can see, is going to be created as its own layer. The same holds true for things like shapes, which we'll get into a little bit more later. And then the other thing to know is that the order of the layers is very important. So whichever layer appears at the top of your layers panel is going to be the layer that appears at the top of your image. So if I were to click, hold, and drag lizard below space, suddenly the lizard disappears, and it's not actually gone, it's just behind the space image. I'm gonna go ahead, bring him back to the front. The next thing to note with layers is this cool little function called blending modes. So you can see that it says normal at the top of my layers panel. And this is what the blending mode is set to currently. Basically what blending modes are is they tell the selected layer how to interact with all of the layers beneath it. And how it works is basically every different color that you see on a computer has its own numerical value. And the blending modes basically tell the color numbers of your selected layer how to interact with the color numbers of the lower layers. So you can see if I do something like multiply, that's pretty self-explanatory. It just multiplies the color codes. I don't know what mathematically all of these do, but when I'm working with blending modes, I generally kind of just like to scroll through all of them and see which one I like the most. Let's just change this to overlay now. I'll change it back to normal if I need to later, but you can kind of see how cool that looks already. The next thing to note with layers after blending modes are adjustment layers. So let's come over to our adjustment panel. And what adjustment layers do, again, these are like filters. They allow you to control a wide variety of things. So brightness, contrast, hue, saturation, levels. You can create gradient maps, all sorts of things. And the cool thing with adjustment layers is they are non-destructive. So you can slap these layers over your images and then delete them later without deleting the entire image. So for example, with the lizard, I could come up here to image, I could go adjustments, and I could do brightness contrast or something, but it'll apply it directly to the lizard layer. As opposed to an adjustment layer, if I just click on brightness contrast, you can see I get a separate layer just for brightness and contrast instead of impacting the lizard layer directly. So you can see if I turn it up. And the thing to know with adjustment layers is that they will affect all the layers beneath them. So if I were to move it underneath the lizard layer, suddenly the lizard isn't getting the brightness contrast adjustments. It's only the space layer. The reason the lizard is still changing when I do this is because of the blending mode, so I'll turn that off. And now you can really see how that adjustment layer is working. And I am actually going to go ahead and just delete that because I don't like the way that it looks. Oh. Boop. One last thing before I move on for talking about layers. You can see down here you have the option to create layers by clicking on this little half circle, and this includes all your adjustment layers, but it also includes just like full solid color layers, like red, for example. I'll just cancel that. Alright, so now that I've kind of gone over layers, we can start to talk about the tools of Photoshop. Tools kind of fall into like 4 different categories, in my opinion. So you have your selection tools, your editing tools, your path tools, and your navigation tools. I'm just going to kind of tackle these groups one at a time, starting with selection tools. So selection tools, as the name implies, doesn't really allow you to do any editing. It's more just about choosing different layers or choosing parts of your image to work with. So the most common selection tool is the most tool. It's the first tool on your toolbar, shortcut V. And basically what it does is it allows you to click on different parts of your image, and you can see it'll automatically change which layer is selected depending on where you click, and then you can click and drag them around to move them, hence the move tool. Something to note up here in the move tool options, if you start working with groups, so we could group space and lizard, so that it's still separate layers, but it's one group, and then we can change our move tool so you can move the group. So if you click on one, it'll move everything in the entire group, but I'm going to keep it set to layers. The other options up here, so show transform controls, basically whenever you select something, it'll make this little like resizing bounding box appear around it. If I were to check that off, now it's gone. Go ahead and turn that back on. And then these options over here are alignment options. So these apply when you have more than one layer selected with the move tool. So I'm gonna go ahead, grab the space layer first, shift click to grab the lizard. You can see they're both highlighted over here, which means they're both selected. And now let's say I go align right, my lizard's gonna move to the right. It's important to note that the second object will align to the first object. So let's say I pick the lizard first and then space. Now space is going to align to the lizard. Go ahead, undo that. Boop. All right, so next up we have our rectangular marquee tool. And basically what this does is it creates selection areas by clicking, holding, and dragging. So you can see I make a rectangle. And what these selection areas do is it tells Photoshop that you only want to work inside of that area. So just to demonstrate this, I'll grab my paintbrush real quick. Oh, let's select a layer. Rasterize it. So let's say that I want to paint on the space layer. If I click outside the bounding box, which I'm doing right now, nothing happens. But when I click inside of it, now I'm painting. Go ahead and undo those paint strokes. Up here with the rectangular marquee tool options, you'll see these sort of different pathfinder icons. So right now it's set so that every time I click and drag, it creates a new selection area. If I were to change it to the second one, combine, now when I click and drag, it just adds to the extant selection area. If I were to do subtract, as you might guess, subtracts from the selection area. Or intersect will take whatever is extant, take whatever you draw, and figure out the common area between them. Feathering kind of refers to the fade of the bounding box area. So with a feather of 0, these edges are super sharp. If we were to turn it up to like 25 or something, then it would like gradually bleed out of the box. And that's about all I need to cover with the rectangular marquee. So next on our list is the lasso tool. The lasso also creates selection areas, but it does so by clicking, holding, dragging, and drawing the area you want. And I will say the magnetic lasso, which is hidden underneath the lasso tool, automatically snaps to edges. So something like this lizard would be really good to use it on. But since I'm only covering the surface level tools, I'm not going to be showing off the magnetic lasso. You can see I draw that, and now I have this selection area. It has the same sort of tool options as the rectangular marquee. The only difference is the anti-alias. So if we were to turn this off, right now it's kind of like automatically smoothing the rough line that I draw. If I turned it off, the area that I drew, it would just keep it exactly instead of trying to smooth it for me. Turn that back on. Next on our list, we have our object select tool. But I will say, even though this is the primary tool, the quick selection tool is much more useful and what you're going to be using most of the time. So I'm going to show this one off instead. I will say the object select tool, basically you just draw a box around something and Photoshop tries to figure out what it is you're trying to select. So let's say I'm trying to select that galaxy. You can see it kind of guessed, tried to select the galaxy. But it's not very accurate and I don't use it that much. So I'm going to show off the quick selection tool instead. This is also for creating selection areas. But how the magic wand works is you click and sort of paint an area, and then Photoshop guesses what it is you're trying to select based on either like color similarities or edge detection. So you can see if I start trying to draw this lizard, instead of having to draw around it, I can just kind of draw on its tail. Or I can even just click and Photoshop just kind of tries to guess what it is I'm trying to select. You'll notice we can set it to subtraction up here. So let's say I get rid of it a little bit. You can change the size and a couple of other brush settings for it. And then sample all layers is if you are basically, instead of just like working with one layer when Photoshop's trying to determine what it is you're trying to select, if you have sample all layers turned on, it just looks at the composite image when making your selections, if that makes sense. Let me go ahead, get rid of that selection area. And the last item on the selection tool agenda is the eyedropper tool, shortcut I. This one's a little different. Instead of working with selection areas or picking layers, the eyedropper is for colors. So basically, wherever you click, your active color will change to the sampled color. And you'll be able to see that reflected up here in color. So let's just click on the space, boom, turns blue. Clicks on lizard, turns orange. Well, orange. Here, pretty white, dark blue. You get the picture. And color will be part of some of the tools that I show off with editing tools. So we'll see this eyedropper come into play more a little bit. All right, so that's it for selection tools. Next up, we have our editing tools, the first of which is the crop tool. And the crop tool, as you might guess, just allows you to crop your image. So up top, you can do this cropping manually by specifying the pixel, basically the size of the image that you want. You can also, boom, invert width and height. We're not going to do that. Or you can do it manually. So as soon as you hit crop, I'm sure you noticed this box appear, and we can grab this. Oh, let's actually change. So the reason I changed it to ratio is because I had it set to a fixed aspect ratio, and I don't want that. So when I had it set to width, height, resolution, everything was sort of locked in place. But if I change it to ratio, then I have free control over the bounding box. Go ahead, click this check mark, and we're good. So next up after the crop tool is the brush tool, which I just showed off. It's this tool here, shortcut B, and it allows you to paint on whatever layer you have selected just by clicking and dragging around. And again, you can use your eyedropper to change the color of the brush. You can also just like select it manually from anything up here. And then you can note that you can actually use blending modes with your brush. So instead of just painting over it opaquely, it's interacting with the layers below it. You can change the opacity, the flow. The flow basically determines how like far behind your mouse the paintbrush follows. It's a little weird. And then you have some options for if you're using like a Wacom tablet, which I'm not, so I'm not going to talk about these right now. Well, actually, I'll show off symmetry. Symmetry is kind of cool. So you can set symmetrical, basically just points of symmetry. It's like I just made a mandala. You can move it wherever you want it to be. And then whenever you draw, you'll get reflections symmetry. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. And yeah, we'll turn symmetry off. The other thing to note with brushes, you can change the size, you can change the hardness. I'll just show you. So if hardness is all the way up, you'll notice there's like not any bleeding off the edge of the brush. But if it's all the way down, we get the solid color in the middle, and it kind of fades gradually into less opacity. And then the last thing to notice with brushes are the brush library. So you have so many different brush options you can use. You can also change specific settings of the brush you're using. You can customize and make your own brushes, and you can eventually save them if you want. I'm not really going to get into that too much, but it is cool to know after you open your brush library, there's a lot of different presets, and you can actually, so that's saving it. But you can create groups, and you can download different brush packs off the internet and find them in here. All right, that does it for the brush tool. Next up, we have our spot healing brush. And what this does, this is really good for like getting rid of blemishes, getting rid of dirt stains, that thing. All you do is click and drag. There's not anything too great in this image to demonstrate it on. But let's zoom into this lizard and see what we can find. So let's say this thing on its neck right here is a blemish and you want to get rid of it. You can literally just click, drag, draw over it, and Photoshop tries to guess what it is you're trying to get rid of and gets rid of it. And you can see it actually did a really good job this time. Boom, gone. Pretty powerful, pretty useful tool. Again, not the most important tool with an image like this, but if you were editing, like, let's say a close-up of someone's face, you would want to use the spot healing brush tool to get rid of, again, acne. If they had like dirt spots on their clothes or like food stains or something like that, that is when the spot healing brush comes into play. You can change some of the options up here. Again, you can kind of work with blending modes. Content aware is just like Photoshop's absolute best guess of what you're trying to fix and fixing it for you. Whereas proximity match kind of like looks at all the surrounding information of the brush and like tries to figure out what is most dissimilar. So let's say there's like a big blue spot on this lizard's tail that I wanted to get rid of. If I had proximity match turned on, I could just like click and paint over it. And Photoshop would be like, wow, everything else is brown, but there's this blue spot. It's probably the blue spot they're trying to get rid of. Yeah. So next up we have our clone stamp. This is a personal favorite tool of mine. It's a little hard to explain, so bear with me. But basically how the clone stamp tool works is it allows you to copy a part of an image and then basically repaste the image, like repaint the image with your captured point as the new origin point. And maybe it'll make more sense if I just demonstrate it. So you'll notice if I click, I can't use the clone stamp because there's no source point. So the first thing you have to do with the clone stamp is define a source point. And the way you do that is by holding Alt on a PC, Option on a Mac, clicking, and now I've defined the source point. So now wherever I click again is going to be the new origin point. So if I paint the face here, let's say, and then I continue painting, it'll start to repaint the rest of the image based on where this head is located. So you can see the kind of spiral galaxy appearing to the top right of it. You can see the lizard's tail. And let's say I don't want to do that. What I actually want to do is just like repaint this lizard's head over and over again. I would have to recapture the source point every time. So let's just alt click, paint it, grab it, paint it, and you get the point. I just have to recapture the source point each time. We'll go ahead and leave these lizards chilling, why not? Next up we have our eraser, which is, you know, pretty self-explanatory. You have a lot of the same options as the paintbrush tool, so you can do like cool negative space painting if you want with one of these crazy brushes. Let's grab, why not? Let's grab, this is a pretty weird looking one. So you can see I'm erasing with this kind of weird pattern. Let's go ahead and undo all of those. Bring my lizard head back. We'll go ahead, just change it back to a normal eraser, and you can grab the eraser again. And you can just see clicking, dragging, and erasing whichever layer I have selected. Pretty self-explanatory, that eraser tool, shortcut-y. It's a good one. Keep it at the ready. After our eraser tool, we have our gradient tool, shortcut G. This, as you might guess, creates gradients, and it does so by just like clicking and dragging in the direction that you want to create a gradient. Bam. Go ahead and undo it. You'll notice you can change the type of gradient up here, so it's got radial gradient. Boom. And the other options, and you can change the gradient itself by double clicking on the gradient up here, and then you can set the colors. Cool. All right, after our gradient tool, we have our blur tool. No shortcut on this one, and this, as you might guess, just pixelates your image. You can turn up the strength to get more or less pixelation. Let's see. This thing just gets kind of blurry. Go ahead, undo it. So this is a good tool when you're trying to, let's say you have like a picture of some mountains or a mountain stream or something, and you want the mountains to look farther away, so you blur them out to create a sense of atmospheric perspective, that sort of thing. After the blur tool, we have our dodge tool, which just lightens an area. So I'll still use this on the space layer. You can see everything just getting brighter, and I'll undo it and redo it so you can kind of see what that looks like. And I actually kind of like it, so we'll keep that change. I know I'm mostly just concentrating on the primary layer tools, but if you click, hold, and drag and look at the subtools, the burn tool kind of does the opposite of the dodge tool, so it makes the image darker. And then the sponge tool, I believe, desaturates, so you can see I can start to make things black and white, get rid of all the color information. But who would ever want to do that to space? So I'm going to undo it. Go ahead and set this back to the dodge tool. After the dodge tool, the last editing tool on our list is the text tool, and this allows you to place text on your image. So there's two ways to do this. You can either just click and start typing, and the bounding box of the text will just conform to whatever it is you're typing, or you can click, hold, and drag and set the size of the box before you type. So now you can see when you get to the edge of the box, it goes down to the next line. Good thing to note with the text tool, the fonts and I guess the what's the word I'm looking for? The typeface here, and then, you know, font modifications. So if we were like Times or something, we could make it italic. Where's it good? There we go, italic, bold, that sort of thing. You can change the size of the font here, and you can also change the way it aligns to its bounding box. We'll just keep it center alignment. Let's put something here. Space is cool. Great. You'll notice you can also change the color of your text. Go ahead. Let's make it purple. Actually, it's objectively the best color. More reddish purple. Actually, dark purple. And move it over here. Cool. Okay, can't really see it. Who cares? So another thing to notice with the text tool, whenever you create text, instead of adding it to whatever layer you're working on, it basically creates a new layer for the text above whichever layer you have selected. So because I had the space layer selected, it created my text layer right above it. If I had the lizard layer selected, when I started typing, the new text layer would appear above the lizard layer. Go ahead, cancel that. And that does it for our editing tools. Next up, we have our path tools. The first being the pen tool. And how path tools work is they essentially work to create vector paths. And I'll just show you how to actually make a path with the tool. So if you just click, you'll create vertices. If you click, hold, and drag, then you can make curves. You'll notice a little circle appears next to the pen icon whenever you can close off a shape. So right now we have a closed off path. Then after you've created your path, you'll notice that it appears over here in your work path. Oh, we still have our mandala path. Look at that. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And you can do a couple of different things with paths. So with our pen tool still collected, you'll see that we can make a selection, which just makes a selection area, which I'm sure you know by now. You can create a mask, which I'm not going to get too much into masking today, so I'll just skip that. Or you can create a shape. Note that when you make a shape, you will actually create a new shape layer that shape exists on by itself. The cool thing about paths, well, a couple cool things about paths. So for one, it's vector based, so you can scale anything you make with paths as big or as small as you want. And because it's based on math and not pixels, you can scale without any resolution loss. Another cool thing, so let's say we wanted to duplicate this shape. We can move our work path. We don't want the shape path. Go back to our pen tool, and we can create another shape. And you can do that as many times as you want and just keep using the same path. Another thing to note with the pen tool is that it has the same sort of pathfinder options. You can do combine shapes, subtract shapes, that sort of thing. I don't think I need to demonstrate it. But you do need to take note that you'll only have one work path layer. So now you can see the triangle and this weird shape are both in the same path layer. And everything that I make appears in the same path layer. The way around this is to create a new path, and then you can draw stuff in here. And now you can see we have two different path layers to choose from. Let me go ahead and delete them. Delete the shape path. Cool. So next up on our path tool list is the path selection tool. So it's kind of like the path equivalent of what the move tool does with layers. So let's go ahead and make some paths again. So now if I had my move tool and I wanted to pick these triangles, I couldn't. I can only select layers, which is a little frustrating. So the way around this is to use the path select tool, which tells Photoshop that you are looking for paths. It's over here. Shortcut A. And now I can click on these paths like so. You get the idea. Cool. After that, the last tool, let's go ahead and get rid of this work path again. The last path tool is the rectangle tool, which works very similarly to the pin tool, but again, you can either make paths or you can just straight up make shapes, which I don't. Okay, they do make shape paths. Yep. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Go ahead and call it for our path tools. So the last tool group I need to talk about are the navigation tools. These are pretty quick, pretty simple. We have our hand tool and our zoom tool. So the hand tool, I'm going to have to zoom in to demonstrate this, basically just allows you to pan around your image by clicking and dragging. So you're working on this part, boop, but now you need to work on this part. Hand tool. Your zoom tool, by clicking and dragging to the right, zooms in. By clicking and dragging to the left, zooms out. And wherever you click is where the program will zoom into or out from. All right, and that does it for all of our tools. The last thing I want to talk about before I show you guys how to export are shortcuts. If you want to be a whiz with Photoshop one day, or even if you want to work inside of Photoshop without wasting hours upon millennia of time, precious time, you're gonna need to familiarize yourself with shortcuts. So the shortcuts also fall into a couple of different groups. I kind of broke them down into standard shortcuts, tool and layer shortcuts, and navigation shortcuts. So starting with standard shortcuts, what I mean by standard shortcuts are shortcuts that are basically universal across most software. So for example, if I taught you these shortcuts for Photoshop and then you opened up, let's say something not even Adobe, like Microsoft Word, most of the shortcuts are going to be the same between Photoshop and Microsoft Word, or even between like Photoshop and, I don't know, Blender or Illustrator, other Adobe programs. So with all that being said, I'm going to grab a selection area. We'll grab something on space. And the first shortcut is the cut shortcut, which is Control X. As you'll see, cuts out that block. Go ahead and undo that. Very similar to Command X is Command C, or Control C, pardon me. Command C and Command X if you're on a Mac, Control X, Control C if you're on PC. But anyways, Control C is to copy. So now I copy this without cutting it out, and then if I hit Control V, it's to paste. And you'll notice I have a new layer right here. You can't see where it is because I haven't moved it. But now you'll notice that I've copied and pasted my selection. Go ahead and delete that. So again, that is Control X to cut, Control C to copy, and Control V to paste. I can't even tell you how much Control C'ing and Control V'ing I do as a designer and artist. So those really are the staples. Next up, we have Command Z, Command/Control Z. And this I probably even use more than Command C, Command V. Control Z is to undo. So let's just go ahead, make some ugly brush strokes. Control Z undoes it. Amazing. Such a time saver. The flip side of Control Z is Control Shift Z, which redoes it. So Control Z undo, Control Shift Z redo. The last standard shortcut I want to show you is Control S, which is to save. You'll notice the first time I do it, because I haven't saved this yet, my computer's gonna be like, okay, where do you want us to save this? So let's just save it in here, practice 2. Now that it's been saved once, if I hit Control S, it just saves. So you can see Control S says saving up here, boom. Let's go ahead, undo that, Control S, saving, boom. Just saves you a lot of time instead of having to come up to File, Save every time. Moving on to Tool and Layer shortcuts. Probably the first two I'm going to show you might be arguably the two most important. These are the Option and Shift shortcuts. So what Option does, it depends on the tool, but basically Option is just a quick way to modify the tool. So you'll notice up here, if I hold Option, it'll automatically turn to the minus select. So let's just go ahead and select something, part of this lizard. And you'll notice there's a little plus icon inside of my quick select tool. But if I hold Alt or Option, if I were on a Mac, then the minus symbol appears and I can just paint it away. I release Option, plus, hold Option, minus. Pretty useful, I would say. The other modifier, what's a good one to show this with? I think I'll just keep using the same tool. So let's say I have it set so that each time I have it set to a new selection up here. If I hold Shift, the plus appears. If I hold Alt, the minus appears. And yeah, so again, just kind of quick tool modifiers depending on what you're using. I guess that'd be better for the rectangular marquee. So rectangular marquee, I'm not holding Shift or Option. Boop. It just creates a new one every time. But then if I hold Shift before I draw, now it's adding. If I hold Alt, subtracting. You get the point. Another thing to know about Shift, though, is that it allows you to create perfect angles as well as like perfect aspect ratios. So what I mean by that, let's say, take for example the rectangular marquee tool. Let's say I don't want a rectangle, I want a perfect square. If I click, hold and drag, and then I hold shift, it's gonna make it an automatic square. Same thing if I did like the ellipse, hold shift, perfect circle. So that's what I mean by maintaining perfect aspect ratios. Let's look at something like let's go with the line tool. So let's say I'm just like trying to draw some lines. If I can just click and draw, but if I hold shift, it'll be constrained to 45-degree angles, like so. Super useful, more useful in a program like Illustrator, I would say, but still something worth taking note of in Photoshop. Cool, so after shift and option, we have our brackets, which controls the sizes of tools. So left bracket makes your tool smaller, right bracket makes it larger. Again, super useful, just something you're gonna wanna get used to, because coming up to here and trying to manually change your size just is not an effective workflow, it just isn't. Instead, brackets. After brackets, we have Command D, which is the shortcut to deselect. So let's say I want to deselect this circle because I'm trying to work outside of it now. Boom, Control D. Awesome, it's gone. After Control D, we have Control Shift I, which inverts your selection area. So let's say I want to work on everything that isn't this lizard's face. I can draw my box around it, but then Control Shift I. Now everything but this box is selected. And then if I Control Shift I again, boom, inverts it back to the box. Super, super useful when you're trying to make complex selection areas. Control Shift N creates a new layer. And you can make it, you can color code it, you can do blending modes, that sort of thing. I'm not going to create a new layer though. Next up we have my personal favorite, Control Shift Option E. This is a somewhat complex one for an introduction tutorial, but I absolutely love it. I had to include it. What it does is it takes all of your extant layers and combines them into a single layer. So let's say you're working on an art project and you get to a stage where you really like it, but you're not sure if you should be done working on it or not yet, but you want to save the iteration where it is now. You do Control Shift Alt E, and now you can see layer 1. If we turn off all of our other layers, it's still the same. Go ahead, turn these back on, but I could keep working. I could just make this layer invisible, keep working, and if I decide that I hate the changes that I make after this point, I still have this layer chilling, so I can come back and save it if I need to. Export it like that. The last tool I want to talk about, or the last shortcut, pardon me, for the tool and layer shortcuts is Option, click and drag, and basically this is the equivalent of doing Control C, Control V. It's just a quick way to copy and paste. So let's say we want to copy this text layer. If I hold Alt before I click on it, you'll notice this second icon appears, and this is only with the Move tool selection, I should have clarified. But you hold Alt, click, drag. Oh, it's because I have this layer selected. Let's get rid of it. Alt, click, drag, space is cool. Bam. And go ahead, Control Z to get rid of those. All right, the last group of shortcuts I want to talk about are the navigation shortcuts, and they are so important. So if you, no matter what tool you have selected, if you hold spacebar, it changes the hand tool to the active tool. So you can pan around without having to come over to your hand tool selected each time, no matter what tool you have selected. You hold spacebar, you're on the hand tool. And then Control plus and Control minus work like the zoom tool. So Control minus zooms out, Control plus zooms in. The only downside to this compared to the actual zoom tool is it'll just automatically zoom in or out to the center of the image. Whereas again, with the zoom tool, you can zoom into specific spots. But a combination of Control plus and spacebar allow you to navigate with ease. go ahead, zoom back out. All right, so that does it. I think for our shortcuts, the last thing I need to cover in this workshop is how to save your beautiful finished product. And I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna turn on a blending mode, I think, just to make something a little more fun to export. I like that. Look at that. Space is so cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. So I already showed you how to save as when I was kind of demonstrating the save shortcut, but we're going to talk about it again here. So when you go to save as, the default file type is a Photoshop file type, a .psd. So if you save a .psd, what it'll do is it'll save all of your different layers, all of your adjustments, just like all of your work so far in the way that you have been seeing it. And this is the sort of thing that you want to save it as if you're going to come back and work on the image again later, if you need to like save it and move to a different computer to keep working, that sort of thing. You want to save as a Photoshop file. The downside to Photoshop files is you can't actually use them anywhere really outside of editing. You can't just like slap a Photoshop file on your Facebook feed, for example. You have to export it as a different format. That being said, I always save my Photoshop files just so I can come back to them. You never know what you're going to need to change. You never know what clients are going to want. You never know what you're going to see in the future. So I always save a Photoshop file first. We can go back to save as and look at some of the different options. So let's say you're done with your work and you actually, want to do something with it, want to share it, want to be able to print it. You have to export it, unless you're printing from Photoshop, then you can just bring your PSD. But if you're printing from a different program, you'll have to save as a more common file type, like a .tiff or like a .jpeg is probably the most common. And so I'll just go ahead, save the JPEG. You'll notice you'll get some JPEG options. You can change the image quality, like it says on the slider, a larger file size for higher quality, which makes sense. The lower quality, the blurrier the image is going to be, but the smaller the file size will be. I'll just go ahead and turn this up to like 8, 9. Format options, I wouldn't really worry about this. It's pretty complex, but basically it tells browsers how to load your image, essentially. So scans is probably the easiest to explain. It loads your images in however many scans you have set. So if it's 3, it'd start off, like let's say you open your image on Facebook or whatever. It starts off super blurry, and then it makes a second scan and comes gradually into focus, and then by the third scan, it's fully into focus. It just makes it a little bit easier for internet browsers. Again, probably something you're not really worrying about in an intro workshop, so I will shut up. I'll just hit OK, and now we have our JPEG saved. The one other thing I want to talk about before I close off is the export as option. So this is similar to the save as option, but you can export as PNGs, which are, in my opinion, better than JPEGs. And yeah, just something you're going to want to know how to do. So we'll go ahead and change this to PNG, which for some reason is not a save as option. Seems silly to me. The other benefit of doing an export as versus a save as is you can scale your image before you export it. So let's say this needs to be way smaller for whatever it is you're using it for, your business card or website or whatever. You can change the size, and the export as will automatically resample it for you. I'm trying to preserve as much detail as possible. You can change the way it resamples in here, but 99% of the time bicubic automatic is going to work the best. Sometimes I've had to use like nearest neighbor or preserve details, but really bicubic automatic does good work. So I'm just going to go ahead and export this, call it practice 2. And now you'll see if I go to this folder, I have my JPEG file, I have my PNG file, and I have my PSD file. And that, my friends, the good patrons of Studio Co, is it for our introduction to Photoshop workshop. We covered a lot today, so just know that if there's a specific part of this video that you want to reference later, we actually have a whole other series of videos that covers each tool group one at a time. So let's say you're like, oh my gosh, how does the clone stamp tool work? Instead of trying to open up this video and, skim halfway through and figure out where I was talking about the clone stamp tool, instead you can just open up our clone stamp tool tutorial and watch it there. And one other note, more than likely you took this workshop in person or viewed it online, and if this learning style doesn't work for you, we actually have this entire class designed as an asynchronous self-guided online class where it's all written down. We have video tutorials linked inside of the learning modules. We have flashcards. My colleague Tyler Kerr, who kind of did the copy editing, livens it up. He has a really good sense of voice. He's funny, he cracks jokes, so it's just like a really good way to learn. And with all of those plugs, I think that's it from me. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for the construction of this Space Lizard poster. And if you need any help with any Photoshop or other software needs in the future, come into Co-Library room 237 and we will manifest your vision into reality. All right, that is it. Goodbye.